So thanks everybody for coming back for module 3 of 3. This is the end of the 3-part series, and today we're going to be focusing on de-icing and other various anti-icing, de-icing strategies. We'll talk about various de-icing chemicals and materials, and we'll talk a little bit at the end briefly about the post-season activities. So when I get there, we're circling the airport and we're almost done. Just as a refresher, you'll remember that in module 1, we sort of did an introduction. We talked really about the full scale of winter maintenance operations from a planning perspective. And then in module 2, we talked a little bit about preseason activities and preparations, sort of game day plowing activities, and then we talked about post-storm considerations that we ought to have in our toolkit. So we'll get started then on module 3. And so I'll do an even briefer advertisement because I think everybody here has probably heard it, but again, I'll simply say that, again, there's, some of you are from outside of Delaware. And so there's a center in each state. I really do encourage you, follow your centers, be involved with them. And they're always, I know we are always looking for information from you about what your needs are, whether that's technical assistance, technology transfer, or training topics. And if we're not bringing it or can't bring it, we'll do our best to try to bring it to you. So I really do encourage you to take advantage of that. So again, I'm Matt Carter. I'm going to be the instructor again today. My apologies for that. It's your tough luck, I guess. And again, I'll remind you that, so my experience with winter maintenance is largely based on my time as a public works director in a rural county in Maryland. And so a lot of rural roads experience, but less so on the urban environment or the interstate or that kind of thing. So if your experiences are a little bit different, by all means chime in, feel free to correct me, etc. So I'm particularly enamored with the idea of tying a notice that we're recording today's session with thinking about various bands. So again, if you want to sort of have a brain twister on this one and see if you come up with it towards the end, just as a little mind game for you. So again, Zoom tips, I think you've all seen this by now, would encourage you to remain muted when you're not speaking. You can have your camera on or off, whichever is your pleasure, that's fine. And we'll do just a couple of polls like we've done before, just to gather a little bit of information here and there. And, by all means, use the chat box, give some, again, if you want to raise a question that way, that's fine. If you want to sort of share an experience or, anything along those lines, that's a great way to do that. There are some reactions you can use from time to time as well. And, again, interaction is good. So, and particularly if you think that what I'm talking about is inconsistent with what your experiences have been, or it doesn't just sound right, by all means, let's chat it up and talk about those issues. So again, I think most of you, but not all of you, were in the previous modules, but if all of you would just throw into the chat pod your name and agency, what state you're from. If you've got other people there with you, more than just one, if you can just drop their names in, that'll help Sandy Wolf keep track of who was here today. And if you want to add something funny in there, that's fine too. We're a pretty informal crowd. So again, in the first 2 modules, we talked about that, you've seen that. And today we're going to focus on de-icing materials and post-season stuff. And again, I draw your attention to many of the slides in the lower left corner. Will have a link to primarily these references, but perhaps some others here and there. And I would also tell you that the slides for today are on our website. If Sandy or Rusty can, when they get a chance, drop the link for that in the chat box. You know, go there and have a look at those if you want to resort back to those. And those as a PDF, well, no, some of those will be hot linked as hyperlinks, not all of them. So if you can put in the nope, I'm sorry, I already did that. This is a poll question. Let me get my ducks in a row here. And so we just want to do a quick poll question to see who I've got here today, just to make sure. So if you could enter that poll real quick, give that just 20 or 30 seconds here, just to get a sense of who all's been with us on the previous modules. Getting there. Just another couple seconds. I know at DRBA, they have to travel all the way to the front of the room to fill it in. So I like to give them a little bit of time. Okay, so I'll go ahead and end that and share that. So most of you have been with us through all, you know, the previous two modules. And it looks like one of you was just on, you know, module 2. So, so that's good. And so Sandy has loaded up recordings of the previous two modules. So on our Delaware T2 YouTube site. And again, if you guys want to drop the link for that in there as well. You know, if you want to go back and revisit it, if you're that much of a glutton for punishment, by all means. But if you want to share it with other colleagues, you know, and point them to it, by all means, do that. Okay, so we're going to talk about, again, last time we talked a lot about plowing, and so we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about the back end of the truck and what we do with various, you know, de-icing strategies. And so we'll sort of deal mostly with these topics, and the focus will obviously be on the materials themselves. So, and again, I made reference to some of those references. This is one of them, the NCHRP report from the Transportation Research Board. This is a great little document that's available free online, and I'll show you a number of excerpts from that like this, more just to sort of give you an idea of what's in there. And I would encourage you, if some of the details interest you, go back and pull that down online. If you just search for it online, you'll see it, and it's a free download. And there's just a lot of interesting, probably more detail than you ever wanted about snow and ice control materials. One of those is here in terms of sort of cost of materials. Now, this is a little bit dated. This goes back to 2007. And so back then, a median cost for regular rock salt or road salt, whichever you call it, was $36 a ton. Obviously, a lot's changed since then. And, you know, just within the last year or so, Delaware Department of Transportation was paying on average $62 a ton. And so you have to adjust those a little bit based on how things have changed cost-wise, where you run across those. But there's some interesting references in there. So I'm going to use the term freeze point depressants, partly just to be tedious, and partly because I want to sort of impress upon you, it's important to think about what are these various chemicals, mostly salts, but not all, that we use. What are they really doing? And I'm going to get to that shortly to give you an idea of what's really happening when we put salts and other chemicals on the roadway. And of course, they can be a whole variety of forms. The one that most of us are, or almost all of us are familiar with, of course, is rock salt, otherwise known as road salt, otherwise known as sodium chloride. And, sodium chloride is the same compound that's in the shaker on the kitchen table. It's just a coarser material, but it's the same chemical compound. Some of the others, that are sort of pretty common are magnesium chloride and calcium chloride. Some of the other ones start to be a little less common, at least in our part of the country, the mid-Atlantic. And then you get into proprietary materials like magic salt and, Clear Lane and all of these, and these sort of come and go a little bit. And then you have various modified materials where we'll take, molasses and brewing waste and things like that and mix it with salts as well. So there's all different kinds of forms. And then, of course, there's also sand and other abrasives, either by themselves or in a sand salt mixture, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. For all of our materials, whether they're salt, sand, liquids, whatever, we really do need to think about storage. There's still agencies that have to store these in stockpiles outside. Increasingly, the various environmental agencies have some real issues with that if they're not bermed, covered, et cetera. And so you can expect that you'll come under sort of increasing pressure as time goes on from that. And even for those that have covered barns, a lot of times those just aren't large enough. And so that creates a real dance through a busy snow and ice control season. And that's, one of the things to think about over time. If we go back to module 1 and talk about the planning, one of the reasons that I think it's valuable to, periodically, every couple of years, every 5 years, to go through that process of planning and talking it out, is to figure out where your gaps are. What is the thing that's holding you back in terms of your performance, your efficiency, et cetera? And you may find that it's the inability to store an adequate amount of material. For some agencies, that's where they find their sort of bottleneck. So freeze point depressants. The reason that sometimes we use that term, and I'm going to use it to death this afternoon, is that's exactly what we're doing. We want to take the material that's on the roadway or coming to the roadway, and we want to lower its freeze point. We want to, because when it freezes, it goes into a different phase, to use some of the chemical terms, I suppose, that they use. We want to change its phase back to liquid. We want to keep it out of that freezing phase. And so the salts, this is not a perfect analogy, but it's close enough, acts a lot like glycol. And so we put antifreeze in our radiators and use it for other purposes. And really all we're doing is that glycol has a much lower freezing point. And so it's not going to, down to some particular temperature, the material won't freeze. And so we're protecting that radiator by using glycol. Well, here, we want to use freeze point depressants, these various salts and other chemicals, to do the same thing. Where the analogy really does fall apart for us is it's a fairly easy matter when we put antifreeze in our radiator to keep it at a constant concentration, because while we can get some leakage and evaporation and things like that, for the most part, we keep it in the system and it doesn't go anywhere. In the open environment that we work in, more precipitation comes down, it dilutes the brine mixture, it changes it, it runs off the road, and we're going to keep coming back to this number that's 23%, and you'll see why in a little bit. Because for it to be effective, we really want to keep it in a certain concentration range, and that's pretty much our ideal one there, as you'll see. And this is where it comes to. So for those of you that don't like charts and graphs in chemistry and stuff like that, don't freak out. We're not going to go too far into this. But this is called a phase diagram. And so this particular one is for sodium chloride, rock salt, road salt. And what you're seeing here is that the area in, at least for me, it's blue. I'm a little bit colorblind with hues. So, but that center triangle towards the top is where melting is going to occur. So if you look at the bottom in terms of solution concentration, you'll notice that the peak of that is at 23%. And if you use the scale on the left, which is Fahrenheit temperature, you'll see that it comes down from freezing at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and it comes down to about -6 degrees. Now, this is an academic graph, if you will, or a laboratory graph. This is what we do when we put it in a beaker in a laboratory. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes about, you know, what the reality is in the field for us, because you say, well, gosh, I don't use salt down to -6 degrees. And there's a reason for that. And part of that you see by this phase diagram. I'll talk about what some of those numbers are in a minute. But if you notice that as we get farther and farther down in temperature, the range and concentration of the salt brine on the road gets narrower and narrower, and it's pretty hard for us to control it in a range of concentration where melting will actually occur. And so if we get it too diluted and our concentration goes down, we're back into that refreezing situation. And so it just becomes impractical below a certain temperature for us to control it with just sodium chloride. Let's say. So we want to stay in that range is the key. And that little peak down at -6 degrees and 23% is called the eutectic point. So that's a nice little cocktail party term that you can throw around. But basically that's the point for any of the materials we use where it's just no longer effective below that point. And I'm going to show you, I think, yep. So this looks even scarier, but it's the same graph in effect, right? You'll notice that these, they don't have the nice little shaded areas, but these are the same shape as that curve. And so if you look at it, you'll see that the arrow, the purple arrow is pointing to the sodium chloride. Looks very familiar to that same graph. But this illustrates that you can find the same kinds of graphs for other materials like calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, and there's others on here as well. So the same kind of relationship applies to these other materials, but you will notice, and we'll use this information, you'll notice that whereas sodium chloride goes down to about -6 degrees Fahrenheit, well, lo and behold, calcium chloride goes down to about -60. Why wouldn't we just use calcium chloride all the time? I mean, it's obviously so much better. Or magnesium chloride. Well, the first answer, of course, is cost. Those materials are much more expensive, but they're also, as much as we learned it to love and hate rock salt, and the way that it's corrosive to our various materials, whether that's metal, concrete, whatever, magnesium and calcium chlorides can be much more aggressive, and we'll probably see, I think we'll see some examples of that later on as well. So we tend to blend those. Now, this is where laboratory meets reality, right? So in a laboratory setting where we can control the factors, that quote eutectic point that I talked about for sodium chloride is -6. As a practical matter, most of us stop using road salt at somewhere around 15 or even 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're talking road temperature at that point. And the reason for that is because, again, beyond that, we just can't control it and keep it in a brine state, and remelting or refreezing occurs rather. So again, similarly with calcium, magnesium, potassium chlorides, the other materials, you see the same kind of relationship. So calcium chloride, you say, oh, well, it's really only good to minus 25 degrees. Well, for most of us, that's plenty, right? But we're not going to use calcium chloride for the most part in its pure form. We're going to probably blend it and come up with a material that's somewhere between what rock salt alone would give us and what calcium or magnesium or one of the other chlorides would do for us. So I'll give you a break from all the chemistry for a moment. And that's about as chemistry as we're going to get, right? We don't need to get too far in the weeds with this stuff. So we want to think about whatever material we're using, we want to think about the various strategies that we want to use. And again, go back to what I talked about, particularly in module 1, but also in module two, where I talked about we want to know as much as we can about the storm that's coming our way and how it's changing once it gets here. Because the nature of the storm, if it starts out as freezing rain, we're going to do one thing. If it starts out as snow, we're going to do another thing, or we should. And towards the end of this module, or the end of this part of this module, I'll talk about some scenarios once we've introduced some of those various strategies. But we really want to think about in terms of the storm, the timing, and the intensity of the storm and the form of that. But also with our strategies, we want to match those in terms of when we apply them, the rate at which we apply them, how frequently we come back. And we want to use all of the tools in our toolbox if they're that are available to us. And we'll talk about some of those, be it de-icing, anti-icing, pre-wetting, or even abrasives in some instances. So when we talk about various strategies, this is again another one of those NCHRP charts that starts to illustrate, some of the ranges that we would use materials in. And so if we were staying with a traditional conventional strategy of using just de-icing salts, where we're in a very reactive mode, a typical range can be 200, rarely less than that, but about 200 to 700 pounds per lane mile, hopefully not much more than that. Whereas if we use some of the other strategies like anti-icing, which we'll talk about in a minute, we can get the amount of salt that we're using way down. And that saves us cost, that saves us cleanup, that saves the environment. So it's an all-around winner. This is a chart that really just compares how you might use various de-icing chemicals. Again, sodium chloride, followed by calcium chloride, followed by magnesium chloride, potassium acetate, and so on. So again, whether you're using this in a solid phase, which is what we're, all of us are used to, versus a liquid phase in a brine, which some of us are increasingly used to, the kind of rates that you might be using to a certain degree as a function of temperature. So again, you can go back and look at that as well. So, so let's stop and take a look at this, which gets into some salt spreading techniques and gives us a little bit of an idea of what's happening with the salt on the roadway. And it doesn't want to play for me. Oh, I've locked it up. This is wonderful. Stand by. My PowerPoint has decided. There we go. All right. It doesn't want to play that media. Let me try it again. Nope. It played a half an hour ago. I don't know. Try it one more time. Okay. we're gonna have to skip that one. Hopefully the other ones will play for me. Let's see. Otherwise I may drop back and restart PowerPoint. All right, let's talk about the strategies. The video was going to briefly sort of set the table for this, but that's fine. So we'll start. So now we're talking about strategies in terms of how we use particularly freeze point depressants or various salts and other chemicals. And that's de-icing. Where all of us will, I mean, regardless of what other strategy you use, in any significant storm, you're probably going to also use de-icing. It's a reactive strategy. Basically, we're putting material down on top of snow, slush, ice that are already on the road surface and may even be bonded to it. In some instances, it's gotten so far ahead of us that we're literally trying to burn the ice off of the surface. It takes so much in comparison to some of the other techniques to really get the chemical reactions going that we're interested in. And again, you can use the number you want. A Montana study shows that it uses 5 times the amount of material than an anti-icing strategy, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But it's part of our arsenal. Even when we use some of these other strategies, we're going to come back to de-icing. Let me see if I can do this one. I don't know whether it's going to or not. Give it a second. No, it does not want to play my media. Let me just drop out of this, come back into my slide share and see if that makes a difference. Okay, try it one more time. Nope, I don't think it's going to cooperate with me today. I'm not sure why. All right, well, we'll have to work without it. All right, so we talked about de-icing. I took so much time with that, you've probably forgotten what I said about de-icing. But let's talk about anti-icing. And so increasingly, this is something that a lot of agencies are doing. Some still are not. Some have tried it and found it not to their liking, and that's okay. There are some situations where it's not ideal. And we'll talk about, even if it is part of your setup, when you should and shouldn't be using it so that you're most effective. But with anti-icing, as opposed to that reactive sort of strategy that de-icing is, anti-icing is something where we want to get out and be proactive. And so this can, we're most familiar, most of us, with this as a brine material, a liquid material that we put down on the roadway in advance of the storm. But this can also be a dry material. We can put down dry chemicals onto the roadway in advance of the storm. Generally speaking, a liquid application is going to be much more efficient and will have a lot less loss, but it can be either. So for example, at the University of Delaware, on the main campus, the facilities group there, in some instances, less and less now, but when they're dealing with pedestrian pathways, they will just put down dry material on those because it's fairly constrained and they don't get a lot of loss off of the sidewalk. But nonetheless, it can be either, but most of us are familiar with the liquid. And so the idea is that we want to put this material down, and because particularly when it's a liquid brine, we're putting it down and it sort of stays where we put it. other than the wheel traffic and winds and things like that, with if it's on too far advance of the storm, stays put, it's there. And when the precipitation starts, it immediately starts to go back into that liquid stage, and prevents the bonding of the ice layer to begin with, at least for a while. So it gives us a head start on the storm. And so, you know, again, you see this 23% down here, right? So it's going to be important that the material we're putting down on the roadway in advance of the storm in our anti-icing strategy is right in that sweet spot of a storm concentration. Sorry, got an animal in the background. So there's you know, you can make your own brine, you can buy your brine. Again, a larger operation will typically find it advantageous to create their own brine. But, you know, oftentimes if you want to start experimenting with brines, a lot of agencies will connect up with a larger agency like a state DOT and say, hey, we want to experiment with one of our routes. Can we have some brine? Can we buy some brine? And a lot of times there's that kind of collaboration, or there is, at least in our experience. And so again, we can put this down in a lot of different forms. You know, whether it's on that lower left, you see this sort of pencil line application that we're putting it down, whether we're spraying it down like you see in the upper right. There's advantages and disadvantages to each of those. The idea, some would sort of say, well, the pencil line application isn't as good because it's not as uniform. The reality is that once the precipitation starts hitting the surface, it's probably going to spread itself out pretty well, and the wheel traffic is going to assist with that. So it's probably going to get where it needs to be. So it's probably not terribly critical which method you use to get the material on the surface, as long as you can keep it in the travel lanes you're interested in. Well, this one doesn't even want to see if this will try to launch for me. I don't think it will. And so the idea is that, you know, in using brine anti-icing, you know, we get this material on the surface, and whoops, and it's ready when the storm starts, and it can actually speed up the melting process. And I'll show you an example a little bit later that's actually related to pre-wetting, but it's the same concept, and you'll see part of why that's the case. One of the things that we want to think about when we think about anti-icing, though, where we're proactive and we're getting out ahead of the storm, but also in terms of our application rates for any of our salt mixtures, if we're mixing in calcium chloride, we want to be mindful that calcium chloride is sort of a special material, and it's called a hygroscopic material. And what that means is that it actually will absorb, you know, in its dry form on the roadway. If there's you know, you put it down, there's a residual on the road, and it's humid conditions, it's a high dew point overnight, or even during the day, but usually at night. There's a lot of moisture in the atmosphere, and it will actually draw that atmosphere out of the air, or that moisture out of the atmosphere, and create brine, and then change over and actually refreeze. And so, so you want to be a little bit careful with calcium chloride. Again, the key is in not overutilizing it. And that's true with any of our materials, but calcium chloride is a little bit of a special case. So again, if I could show you this video, I would, and it would basically tell you what this is here, that we've got these strategies are reactive versus a proactive approach. However, what we want to think about is when we would use anti-icing. And you know, again, if it's in our arsenal, we're not going to use it with every storm. We may very well use it with most of them. But when we get to some scenarios later on, it'll illustrate a little bit better. But imagine a storm that we expect is going to start out with freezing rain. Well, if we anti-ice and put that residual, those residual chlorides on the surface, and it starts out raining, albeit freezing rain, what we're really going to do is wash that material off of the surface pretty quickly before the temperatures really drop to where we get those freezing conditions, and we'll have wasted it. So we really, really want to be mindful of what the expected trajectory of the storm is going to be. So there's a third strategy that's sort of a little bit of a mix, but it's pre-wetting. And so, and this is increasingly pretty common with a lot of agencies, where we will, instead of just dropping dry material out of the back of our trucks through one or another type of spreader, we will actually either in the bed of the truck in some instances, but more typically using some kind of a small brine tank that supplements it on the truck, will actually trickle in a 23% brine solution onto the salt as it hits the spinner or however it is that we're discharging it, so that we now have salt that's, quote, pre-wetted with a brine solution, a 23% brine solution. And I'll show you in a minute why that can be so impactful, but it has a lot to do with how that material hits and stays on the road where we want it, as opposed to scattering off, and how it already is in a state where it can immediately start the chemical reaction with the frozen ice that's on the roadway. Again, all kinds of studies. Pick the number that you want to pick. I don't care whether it's you know, when the Danes found that 90% stayed on the road, might I do it and come up with 85 or 80, perhaps? Again, the numbers are less important than the fact that we obviously get a significant increase from pre-wetting in terms of retaining the salt on the roadway. And as with the Montana study, we find that we can use a lot less material, which again, saves money, saves impact on the environment, and so on. And so again, you can pre-wet in a lot of different ways. And the upper left, which is a poor photo and an old photo, which probably should tell you that it's sort of a dying approach. But literally, you know, it was common when this was first being done that you would pull the truck under some kind of an applicator, and it would spray or drop or trickle a brine solution onto the loose material in the bed of the truck before it went out on the road. Not a very efficient way to do it, but better than not doing it all, perhaps. On the upper left and upper and lower right, upper right, lower left, you'll see examples of saddle tanks or other kinds of tanks that can be mounted in various places on the truck, where you can put your brine solution and then pipe it down to your spinner like you see in the lower right. So, you know, here's a situation where you've got some spray nozzles that are at a controlled rate, pre-wetting the salt as it hits the spinner and before it gets scattered out onto the roadway. And this is really why pre-wetting can be so effective. If we use our conventional, traditional approach to putting dry road salt or any salts on the roads, this is, again, you can quibble with this. You could go and do your own experiments if you want. You might get slightly different results, but you're going to get results sort of like this. And what we're going to find is that less than half of the material that we put stays in the lane where we wanted it to be. Because of tire traffic, the slope, the crown slope of the road, wind, bounce, all kinds of factors, a good bit of it gets lost to the shoulders or even the ditch areas where it does us little or no good. On the other hand, if we take pre-wetted salt, and again, you might get slightly different results, but you're going to get something like this. And we find that 3/4 of it stays in the lane where we want it, or on the road surface where we want it. And the reason is, and if you think about it, it kind of makes sense that this wetted material is a little bit heavier. It rounds out the sharp edges of it a bit. There's less bounce and scatter. And it immediately wants to go to work right where it is. And the quicker we get it to work on the existing ice, however thin it is on the roadway, the more likely it is to stay put anyway. So I'm not a big fan of academic research because some of it's kind of borders on the silly, but here's one I can get on board with for sure, because it's very practical, right? But it does require a little bit of explanation. And so what we've got here is they took a piece of ice, they put it in, a freezer effectively, and they put a kernel of regular dry salt where the blue lines are pointing on top of the salt block, cube, whatever. But then they also took a piece of pre-wetted salt, again, a grain of salt that had been pre-wetted with a 23% brine condition. And so they both started out in the same place. They're under the same temperature conditions, et cetera. But as you move to the right with the pictures, that's the progression of time. And you'll notice, you have to look a little bit carefully, but look where the arrows point. And actually, how much time has elapsed is not terribly important here. But what we see is, at the same point in time, the pre-wetted salt has already gone to work and is advancing down through the ice cube. As we progress through, it starts just peeling away, right? And it's not even a contest by the time we get to here. Well, why is that? Well, again, it's a couple of different factors, but most of it is that pre-wetted salt already has some brine solution around it, and it's already got that exothermic. Does that impress anybody that I kind of almost know what that term is? It's got that reaction already going, that reaction that generates heat. And so it sort of leverages what the salt itself is going to do once it gets into solution with the material. So, and I'm not even going to try this one because it's going to fail on me. So, and it's okay. These are sort of supplemental, but more to give you a break from me. But the key here that we want to think about, again, comes back. Remember that phase diagram I talked about towards the beginning of this, where we wanted to stay in that area where melting would occur. We didn't want to come down to a lower concentration of salt in the solution, because if we did, refreezing would occur. We wouldn't have enough salt in the concentration to keep doing what it needed to do. Well, as you can imagine, as time goes on, again, whether we're just de-icing, putting dry material down on the road, or whether we've anti-iced or we're pre-wetting, part of what can happen is that the salt gets used up in effect, right? So it gets diluted in the material, and we're now down to a 20% solution, a 19, a 15, a 10, whatever. And so what can happen? Well, that can happen through a variety of ways. We put the material down, the storm's still going on. We don't come back through this area for a couple of hours, several hours. Well, by the time we come back, that material is already diluted out and is no longer working. It can also happen when we start getting heavier precipitation, or we get a change in the nature of the precipitation. It starts changing from a dry, fluffy snow to a real driving, wet kind of snow. Well, we've got a lot more moisture hitting the pavement, so pound for pound, we're diluting that salt at a much faster rate. So we really want to pay attention to what's happening with the storm and what we see happening with conditions on the road, because if we want whatever strategy we're going to use to be effective, we've got to make sure that we're keeping the material at the surface of the road somewhere in that 23% range, because that's where it's going to be most effective for us, particularly as the temperature drops. So, you know, clearly there are some advantages. We're going to hopefully use less salt because we're going to be that much more efficient with the material we're using. You know, reduce wear and tear on the vehicles, the whole bit. As we switch to using various brines, whether it's for anti-icing, pre-wetting, what have you, we're going to have to add another type of storage to our yards, not just a dry salt barn or whatever means we have for storing our dry salt, but now we're going to have to put in some liquid tanks. These don't tend to be terribly complicated, but we do want to make sure that they've got some containment, that they're protected. They're usually going to be in a poly tank, so they're susceptible to being backed into. So we want to make sure they don't, because we're going to create one heck of a mess if we do, and an environmental impact, and we're going to lose all that expensive brine. We typically want to have some kind of slow mixer in there to keep everything in solution. That can take different forms. You can use air, you can use a flocculator. There's different approaches, but and obviously you're in a very corrosive environment. So you want to pick your materials, not just the tank, but anything that's going to come in contact with the brine, like mixers, to be resistant to corrosion. If we are using dry abrasives, again, typically this would be sand, but you know, you could use cinders and things like that. Increasingly, a lot of agencies have gotten away from that because we don't get the melting contribution from it. You know, we get a skid resistance for a while, but it tends to leave a lot of residue on the roadway. A lot of times we have to go back and clean that up. It can, you know, create some problems with damage to vehicles and things like that. So now there's parts of the country that because they get such low temperatures so frequently, that it is still a dominant part of their strategy. And even for those of us in the mid-Atlantic, most agencies will keep at least a little bit of sand on hand because, again, if we're using rock salt, road salt, and you know, it's that late January, early February storm where, you know, the pavement temperatures in particular are down, you know, in the low teens or below, then those salts just aren't going to be effective until the temperature comes back up, usually with daylight hours. And so we may just take and put sand down at intersections and steep hills as a temporary measure until we can get to a point in the temperature scale where our de-icing chemicals can be more effective. Again, I'll spare you the speech that comes with it. There's lots of arguments that out there, not just by the Salt Institute, but by other more scholarly people. And the reality is that, you know, by and large, for most parts of the country, use of de-icing chemicals is more cost effective than abrasives, generally speaking. And again, there's all kinds of studies that have been done that demonstrate that pretty well. And so these are just some of those. If you are going to have even sort of a contingency stockpile of salt, sand, or other abrasives on hand, which again wouldn't be unusual, you do want to make sure that you frost-proof it. So you're going to want to get a little bit of chlorides mixed in there to make sure that when you go to use it, you know, the sand pile that absorbed a lot of water a couple of days ago in the rainstorm isn't just a solid hunk of ice that's not useful to you. So let me do a poll question here and ask you about exactly that. Get the other one down here. So tell us about what strategies you all use. And this is multiple choice. So if you're using multiple strategies, clue us in a little bit. There we go. I woke at least somebody up. There we go. There we go. Now we're getting there. We're almost there. Okay. Well, we may have leveled out. Let's see. I'll give it just another second, see if there's anybody else lingering out there. Okay. So, everybody that responded uses anti-icing, and that's not the common response. Although increasingly we're coming towards that, a lot of agencies are using that. So I'm a little surprised at how few of you use pre-wetting. That's interesting, because usually once we're in the brine business, we'll come with those. And again, I mean, even, so one of the things that we see here that's not surprising is that most of us are going to probably have multiple tools in the toolbox. And, again, we're going to include sand and abrasives with that, at least a sand salt mix, so that if the temperatures really drop, we've got some options. So that's great. Well, thanks for that. I'll stop sharing that. Jump out of that. So again, I alluded to this earlier. I won't belabor this point, but again, going back to one of the NCHRP reports, there's some good information about how different kinds of chemicals and abrasives can be impactful on the environment. And, I'll let you explore that at your leisure. But, whether that's impact to, the soils themselves and how they can change pH and all of that, whether it's air quality. So for example, abrasives can be very impactful for air quality, but also the impact it can have on the quality of the runoff and how it enters receiving waters and sort of all the bugs and bunnies and flora and fauna, right? So it's worth sort of reviewing that as you consider some different choices as you go along. So we know, I mean, again, chlorides are the devil, we know, particularly road salt. We know that it impacts concrete. However, our use of salt with concrete roadways and sidewalks and what have you tends to be a bit of a cop-out for poor concrete finishing. And I say that, I guess, as a sort of weaselly sort of promotion for the concrete best management practices course we're going to have on Monday, that there's still time to sign up for. And we impress upon in that course the idea that if you finish concrete well, if you do a good job with it, then reasonable use of chlorides should not cause early deterioration of that concrete. It's just a little bit of a cop-out. That being said, we know that if we use unreasonable amounts of chlorides, we're going to have an adverse impact on concrete. And so, we need to finish our concrete well, and then we have to do our winter maintenance well. There just really isn't the same excuse that there was 20, 30, 40 years ago for just loading salts to the roadways. We have the right kind of tools at our disposal to manage it much better, and so we should do that. There's no sense in throwing money away by using excess salt, impacting the environment, and damaging our infrastructure all in one fell swoop. When we get into some of the other, materials, for some of those, particularly when we get into, some of the less used ones, there just isn't as much research done on. And so it's not as clear. The bottom line is that using less of these materials is, generally speaking, better. We know that all of the materials we use are going to have some adverse impacts, whether it's on concrete or some of the other receptors that we would have. And again, you can go back to NCHRP to get some of the specifics on that and how different materials will act different ways. And again, when I skip by something like this, if you go, wow, I really wanted to spend a few minutes looking at that, again, you can go and look at the slides that are available on our website. All these slides are there. And so I just want to sort of introduce you to that material. Again, I talked about this earlier about calcium chloride being a hygroscopic material. And again, this is what can happen. It doesn't mean we shouldn't use calcium chloride, and I don't want to be confused about that one bit. It's just that we want to be mindful that if it remains on the roadway as a residual in an excess amount, and then we have those dense air conditions, very humid conditions where there's a lot of moisture in the atmosphere, we can actually create ice on the roadway, which I think it's fair to say is not consistent with what our plan was. There's also urea. This was being used. It's sort of fallen out of favor. It's something that largely we get from natural gas synthesization. It's basically a fertilizer. But it sort of is not worth its trouble, is what a lot of agencies have decided. Now, that's not true everywhere. And, again, one of the things that we find in general is something that we tried 20 years ago, we come back and somebody starts fishing around with it a little bit and playing around with it and saying, well, you know what, maybe we just weren't using it well. And so you never know how these things might come back around. So I've talked about temperature and weather and things like that, and I want to come back and sort of reinforce this idea that when we talk about temperature, it's really important that we get ourselves out of the habit of thinking about the air temperature. It's not that the air temperature isn't important. It is to a certain extent, but what we really care about is the interface where all this stuff is happening. And the interface is the pavement, the roadway, right? That's where this material comes and it settles, and we've got to deal with it. We're not dealing with it 4, 5, 6 feet up above the surface where the temperature might be different. And so we really want to know as much as we can about what the pavement temperature is, and if we can get it, what the subsurface is. Now, we know generally what we can expect. In the early part of the season, in mid-December in Delaware, in a typical winter, whatever that is, we would expect that in all likelihood, it might be a frigid day, relatively speaking. It might be, 30 degrees, 28 degrees, but the surface during the day could very well be 40 degrees. Particularly if it's asphalt, the subsurface could be 42, 45 degrees. And so if you think about what's happening in that kind of situation, the roadway is acting a little bit like a radiator. And so it's actually going to help us in that situation as the storm starts, at least initially, and particularly during the daytime when we get some of the reflective assistance from the sun. On the other hand, you think about that late February storm where it's been a particularly frigid winter. We've had a lot of deep freeze days and weeks. And maybe, that storm that starts at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, again, it might be 32 degrees. You go, well, it's not even that cold. I say, yeah, but the pavement temperature is 26 degrees or 24 degrees. And the subsurface is just a little bit warmer than that, not much, because we've really reached down into it and chilled it all down. In that instance, the road is going to be our enemy because it's going to fight us, because it's going to encourage the formation of ice, not discourage it. So thinking about what those temperatures are, at least seasonally, but also trying to drill down and get that information. And again, this is something that it's just too cheap to get this information nowadays. We've got in Delaware, we've got traffic cameras that have really, really impressive weather stations on them. where they can read the temperature, certainly of the pavement. In some instances, like you see on the lower right, we can have a pavement sensor that'll tell us some information about the subsurface as well. So if we have those anywhere near where we're operating, that can be great information. But if we don't have that, literally, let's see if I have one here. Should have been better prepared. But I mean, whoops, let's see if this, I don't think this shows up. You know what it is, it's a heat gun. God knows we've all seen them. I'll hold it against me like this. So, you know, these are $12, $15, $18, $20, $25, right? They're just not that much money. And we can literally carry those in our truck with us and periodically shoot the surface and get an idea of what kind of temperatures we're dealing with. So it really, it's just too easy to get this information, and it can be so impactful to us. But at a minimum, recognizing how seasonally those trends are going to change, so that we can say, well, gosh, this is the same, you know, this sounds like the same storm we had back in December. And I say, yeah, but it's February now. So we're going to fight this one a lot harder than we did that one. And so this comes back again, just sort of reinforcing what the temperature impact on our use of salt is. So this is another way. Again, we were looking at the phase diagrams before, but this just gives you a sense of, you know, in a laboratory environment, without, you know, the vagaries of what goes on out in our world. But, you know, a pound of salt will melt 40 pounds of ice at 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but you drop 10 degrees and it drops fivefold. So its effectiveness really drops off as we get down to that 20 degree or so. And that's why it's not unusual that most managers, you know, street superintendents, public works directors, whomever, who, you know, have experience fighting snowstorms and ice storms, will typically at some point say, hey, at 15 degrees, at 20 degrees, something like that, you know, turn the spinners off. We're just wasting material at this point. You know, the temperature, you know, it'll be daylight in a couple of hours, the temperature will start coming up, and we can resume that. And we might even switch over to using sand or sand salt mixture at you know, critical areas like intersections during that period. But that's why they're telling us that, because they know that it's just not going to be effective and we're just going to lose all of that material. And so again, we can look at different, you know, scenarios, and we'll look at some others here in a minute. But we really want to stay, the key is that we want to stay in that sort of sweet spot, that necking area of that phase diagram that we looked at earlier, with a recognition that as the temperature drops closer and closer to something in the area of 15 or 20 degrees, it's going to be very difficult for us to maintain the proper concentration of chlorides to continue melting in that environment. So again, there's just no way for us to correlate the air temperature to the pavement temperature, but that's okay because we have good means of measuring the pavement temperature. And, you know, going back to what I talked about in module 1, remember I talked about controllable factors and uncontrollable factors, or the notion of an unforced error. You know, so for example, if we get to, I think I talked about this in module 1, if we get to January and a member of the crew gets exposed to the COVID virus and the whole crew has to be quarantined and can't come to work, we're going to have a real gap in our snow fighting capability, or may not be able to do it all. If we've not taken any steps as contingency for that, the public is going to roast us, and probably at least a little bit fair in that instance. Why? Because it was an unforced error. They say, you didn't even think about this? Come on, we've been talking about COVID since March. You know, they don't expect a perfect plan out of us, but they do expect that we're going to have thought about some contingencies for that. Well, by the same effect, if we're using the wrong strategies because we're not paying attention to pavement strategies, then we're probably going to have some unforced errors. So again, this is that fall and spring thing, right? Where again, we want the specific information about a given storm and the pavement conditions and that type of thing. But we really want in the back of our head for sure this idea of sort of just common sense, what's going to be at play. So, you know, in addition to that sort of mid-December versus late February storm scenario with the same kind of storm, think also about, well, you know, it's going to be very cold, the pavements are cold, et cetera, but this storm is going to mostly be a daytime event. And I've got, and we're going to have some really good, strong sunshine. It's not going to be a cloudy day once the storm stops at daylight. And my roadways largely don't have a lot of tree canopy over them, or the leaves are down. They're all hardwoods. So I'm going to get a lot of sun penetration onto my roadways. Well, you know, that's a different scenario than one where you say the roads are really cold. They're, you know, they're going to, you know, be a heat sink to begin with. You know, it's a cloudy day. I've got a lot of canopy over my roadway. Well, then all the forces of evil are just against me in that situation. So you really want to think about how these different factors, at least generally, play into your strategy for fighting the storm, and then get as much specific information as you can. Again, in terms of those sort of unforced errors, black ice is one of those. And you know, black ice was sort of a mysterious thing for a long while, but we understand better what happens. And you can get in, it hurts my head a little bit to think exactly what's going on with black ice, but basically it's when the dew point and the air temperature start to converge. And basically what's happening in that instance is the moisture in the air is allowed to condense on the roadway. And so while we don't have an active precipitation event, be it freezing rain, snow, whatever, what we've got is basically condensation, right? It's sort of similar to what happens to a glass of iced tea in the middle of the summer, where you're drawing moisture out of the air. Well, that's effectively, at least for my nimble brain, what's going on with black ice. Well, we can expect that that's going to more likely happen later in the winter when we're going to have those kinds of right conditions for it. So certainly as the winter progresses and we have, you know, those nights where it's you know, the dew point is high, we want to look at it and say, well, but if it starts, you know, coalescing with the air temperature, we could start to have a problem. And that way we know to anticipate it. We can check, in all likelihood, we probably know the personality of our roads and we know where it's likely to crop up. And so we can use that anecdotal experience to look out for it as well. So let's just look at a couple, again, I'm going to breeze through these because I just want to introduce you to them. There's a lot of content here. That's not terribly the key point. The key point is these are here. I would encourage you to go and pull this report up that's, again, hyperlinked in the slides that are on our website, because they go through, and these, I'm just going to show you a couple of quick ones. They kind of walk through different scenarios and talk about, well, based on pavement temperature, and where we are in the storm, the initial operations, what our subsequent operations ought to be, the kinds of things that we ought to consider. So this one is for a light snowstorm, and it gives us certain, again, these are general guidelines that, particularly if you're a little bit new to managing snow and ice operations, I just think it's useful to go through these because it gives you some ideas of what kind of strategies you might consider. And it really drives home that idea of how I might change it as conditions change and what I might be doing initially versus later in the storm or immediately after the storm. Here's another one that's a light storm with moderate or heavy snow. Again, similar kinds of information you're going to see there. Here's another one where we have freezing rain. So, and this comes back again, we think so much when we think of winter maintenance, we think of snowstorms. Snowstorms are, you know, are difficult to deal with. They're a real problem child. But when we get that, at least for us in the mid-Atlantic, the occasional freezing rain, we wish it was a snowstorm, right? You know, freezing rain is just terrible to deal with. You think about just a few years ago, 3, 4, 5 years ago, Atlanta got an ice storm, and the whole country made fun of them because they weren't prepared for it. Well, yeah, it's Georgia. You know, I thought it was a little unfair how we all piled on. You know, freezing rain is the worst thing that they could have encountered. They probably could have dealt with some of the other kinds of storm types. But anyway, so you go through these different things. So you want to think about different scenarios and realizing that, you know, you may get these different scenarios in the same storm. So you may have, you know, a light snow that then transitions into a freezing rainstorm, or vice versa. And which order they come in and how they combine can mean all the difference in the world. And the more you sort of think that through, so that you intuitively sort of know how you might change your strategies, probably the better off you're going to be over time. So coming back to our you know, the various materials we use, we've got to control the rate, right? So somebody in the organization, in the chain of command, really ought to be trying to manage what kind of rates we put down. That's not to say that the truck operators, the snowplow operators, shouldn't be feeding back and saying, it's great, but I'm having some real problems in certain areas, and I think that we ought to, or vice versa. You know, the amount of material you've got us putting down, or the number of passes that you've got us making on these routes probably is more than necessary. So, you know, having that feedback is terribly important, but at some point, somebody's in the chain of command really should be trying to set at least some guidelines on that. One of the things that we also have to think about is giving particularly chemicals time to work. It's really easy, depending on the configuration of your route, particularly as you get into a more suburban or urbanized area where you're going sort of rounds and circles and in and out of subdivisions and things like that. You could actually come through the same area that you just plowed, you know, 10, 12, 15 minutes ago. Well, if you went through and plowed that and put material down behind you, when you come back through and plow that again, that poor salt didn't even have a chance to really get started doing its job, perhaps. So you know, much like I'm doing now, perhaps not particularly effectively, is where I'm talking about something right now, but I'm trying very hard to think about, well, what am I going to be talking about in a couple of minutes? Am I going in the right direction to set that up, right? In the same vein, you want to do that as a plow operator. You want to, you know, you're plowing this road, you've got a hell of a lot going on right now. It's a very stressful operation. But in addition to that, you want to kind of think about, well, you know, where is my route going to lead me? Am I going to be back through this area shortly? Again, 8, 10, 12, 15, 20 minutes. If I am, then maybe I ought to just plow it, not put any material down now. When I come back around, I'll plow it again and get that material down then. Now, in a different kind of storm scenario, you might not do that. You might say that the better part of valor is to say, it is coming down so hard and so fast that I think if I don't get some material on it now, at least a little bit, that when I come back around, I'm going to have a heavily bonded ice patch to deal with. So there's no one cookie cutter answer to it. All I'm saying is think about how you want to give the material some time to work. So in the same way that we talked about plowing and we talked about sort of special areas, we also want to think about those special areas when it comes to applying salt and other materials. And so, you know, remember when we talked about, for example, super elevated curves that we wanted to push the snow to the lower side, right? So that when, you know, melting occurred in the subsequent days, it would run away from the travel lane, not onto it. Well, here with our de-icing materials, we, in situations like that, like to bias our material to the high side of that, right? So that as it migrates, and it will with the tire traffic and gravity and things like that, that it actually spreads across the part of the roadway that we're wanting to treat. And so we want to think about these other materials as well. We know that bridges oftentimes will need some additional material than the rest of the roadway. We've oftentimes have some tricky curves that sometimes have hills involved as well. Intersections can be particularly tricky as well. So we just want to be mindful of sort of those special considerations and take a slightly different strategy. So in other words, we may be going along and applying, 150, 200 pounds per lane mile along our roadway. Perhaps we've got an intersection that we know has got a downslope to it and has been sort of a tricky intersection for people. Maybe as we, on the last, 50, 100 foot approach to that and through the intersection, maybe we bump that up 50 pounds, and give it a little bit of extra material as an insurance measure. Some of the other areas that we might have, again, if we know that we've got some poor drainage areas where we could get some rephrasing, might want to do that. Again, if we've got an area of roadway where we've got a lot of canopy cover, and we know that, again, the sun's out, we're doing cleanup work, it's going to be pretty good through most of the areas of my route, but in this particular area, the sun is not going to be a benefit. So I want to put a little bit more material there, perhaps, and leave some residual on that stretch of roadway because it's not going to get the benefit of the sun. So just different things we're going to take into consideration, and we'll make exceptions to what our application rates are and where we try to bias that material. So we started early in these modules with weather. We'll come back to it. Again, just to reinforce that the more we know about the storm, and again, what's happening, what has happened, what's happening, and what is expected to happen, the better. We like to make fun of the weatherman. It's the American sport. It's bigger than baseball. The reality is that weather forecasting has gotten much better in the last 20 and 30 years. We have great tools available to us, almost too much information. If you go to the NOAA site for your area, we use the Mount Holly site typically here in the northern Delaware area and Cecil County, Maryland area. It's almost too much information. It's overwhelming, but take some time with that because you really can find out some very useful, the text forecast and things like that can not only tell you what they think is going to happen, but why they think. And that can be really helpful when you don't see the sort of underlying conditions they've assumed will develop. Then maybe it's time to go back and revisit that and realize there's probably been a forecast change. Again, we're lucky in Delaware. We've got a number of spots across the state where we've got in place weather stations that are we can access off the website and see that information in real time. As in addition to the cameras themselves, which are a benefit, most states have some network of cameras. Not all states have weather information at this point. But again, there's a lot of different ways. And then some agencies have their own contracted weather service that gives them even more granular information, and it's worth paying it in their cases. So it's all over the place. The point is avail yourself of what's there. If you don't get to complain about the weatherman, I think is the final thing on that. Again, I come back to this, think about more than just snow. Our storms can take a lot of different forms and they can change throughout the storm. And the more we get that sort of ground into our head and get away from just thinking about snow, the better off we're going to be in terms of developing our strategies. And again, there's all kinds of different information. that may, you know, for some of us is going to be more important than others. So if I'm a urban, you know, tightly packed urban area, wind may not be as much of an issue to me as it would be if I was out in an urban landscape where I had a lot of open fields and things like that, where I could get in a lighter storm, a lot of drifting and filling in of roadways and things like that. So, you know, some of this is going to be more important to one agency than another, but there's just a lot of good weather information out there. And again, I think the key is to not just think in terms of, well, what's the forecast, but really trying to think, well, okay, well, what's happened in the last hours or even the last days, and how might that impact us? You know, so for example, if I've had relatively warm temperatures and a lot of saturating rain for a couple of days before we suddenly got sort of that, you know, whatever they call it, coming down from the north, you know, the heavy frost that comes down, where we go, wow, we're suddenly much colder than we were just a day ago. And now we're getting some kind of a snow or ice storm, and it's wet and it collects on the trees that, you know, the roots of which are already saturated. Well, now we can expect that not only are we going to have drooping branches and drop branches, but we could have trees just coming right over on the roadway and into the power lines and things like that. So thinking about what has preceded that storm, the so-called antecedent conditions, really, really can help us in terms of, you know, I can't change what's going to happen, but I can anticipate what's going to happen better, and I can modify my strategies as a result. And, you know, again, and the format of the NOAA site changes from time to time, quite a bit actually. So you have to root around, but I think the text forecasts in particular that they list can be very, very helpful. Again, this is a little bit dated at this point, version of the DelDOT camera site, but you see the kind of information that you can get on that. So here in this view for this camera, I can see not only what's happening in the atmosphere, but I can see the surface temperature and the subsurface temperature. And that's just really, really good information for me to use in addition to what I can go out in the field and measure. There's lots of equipment that we can get mounted on our vehicles. You know, again, in some instances, this makes sense. The cost of this stuff has come way down. A lot of times this can be integrated into our GPS units or other kind of voice and data systems that can report back and collect this information, and that can be useful to us. You know, there's in the same way that NCHRP report that I talked about earlier has some different scenario information, so do others. So this is one that comes from the SALT Institute. You shouldn't be surprised that there's a bit of an emphasis on the use of SALT as opposed to other things, but nonetheless, I think it's, you know, these are useful tools if you're a little bit new or want to sort of go back and question the way you've, the kind of strategies you've used in the past. And so again, coming back to this guy again, and just remembering, you know, where we want to stay. We want to stay in that part of the phase diagram where melting can occur. And we want to think about the different scenarios that can happen. So again, here are some other ones, right? If we have this blizzard with, you know, very low sustained temperatures going into the storm, we're going to take one approach. If we've got warmer temperatures, you know, associated with that, again, this is similar to that thinking where we think about the same storm in December versus after we've had a permafreeze through the winter and we've got a storm in late February. These kinds of things where we say, how is this, you know, the fact that it's a blizzard isn't enough information for me. I want to know, well, what are we going into it with? What are we likely to come out of it with? The timing of a storm. You know, if this is a storm, you know, so if I get freezing rain and it's coming down at a pretty good pace, well, that's one piece of information. But I want to know more than that. I want to know, well, is this going to be an overnight event or is it going to be during the day? Because that's really interesting to me. How long, it's going to come down at a heavy pace. How long is it going to hover over us? we talking about like an hour, hour and a half of it, about hours of this. Is it going to end towards daybreak? And do I expect sunny skies after that? All of those things are going to change my strategies, whether it's going in, during, or coming out of the storm, or it should, is the point. When we have the special case of whiteout conditions, which don't happen that often for us, but when they do, those are the kinds of situations we've really got to step back and say, what was job one we talked about? Our own safety. We're not going to be doing anybody any good trying to plug along in zero or near zero visibility. It's time to pull off at a safe place and wait it out, because chances are a whiteout condition isn't going to last for hours. Again, in our neck of the woods, in the mid-Atlantic. Other parts of the country, may have different experiences. Taking a call. So this, I think we might have touched on this earlier. Again, make sure that the person that's taking the calls throughout the storm is somebody with a little bit of patience, that isn't worn out, tired. Don't take somebody that's just come in from running a snowplow for 12 or 14 hours and is dog tired and a little bit irritable and put them on the phone with the public. That's just, or if you do, let me come and watch, because that's probably good entertainment for me. It's just not your best choice for that. We really have to do a good job of taking calls with the public. We can create some real enemies if we're not careful. When we do that, we really ought to, I would argue that whoever's taking calls ought to keep at least some kind of rudimentary notes. Who called? When did they call? Where are they at? What's their issue? What did you say back? Particularly if it's confrontational, because we end up getting roasted for this stuff. And if we've got good contemporaneous notes, rather than, well, then he said to me, well, if you've got a written document about it, you're probably that much more credible, particularly if both at the time and when you're questioned about it, you're very calm and reasoned. You're not emotional about it. Be the one that doesn't get emotional in the conversation. I would argue also that if there's a crash, whether there's an injury or not, even if it's property damage only, if it's in your jurisdiction, on your roads that are in your jurisdiction, if you can possibly do it, get somebody out there, get some photographs that are your own. Take a look. If you are able to, take a little look inside the vehicle. Do you see some pharmaceutical bottles spilled out on the floor? Take a picture of that. Or were there alcohol bottles or cans or whatever? Take a picture of that. Don't just rely on a police report, because you don't know exactly what will be recorded, and it may be 2 years before an attorney comes and visits and alleges that you were the ones that were the reason for this crash. When you show them the kind of evidence that you collected, chances are they say, okay, we'll go bother somebody else. It's just some good insurance, assuming that, there was some sort of malfeasance involved. Again, I think I've made the point before, I won't belabor it. I think a little bit of record keeping goes a long way. If you keep records of your storms and what you did and your manpower and things like that over time, that's something you can draw off of and learn from and build budget models off of, and you can build a better snow and ice control plan out of, because you can demonstrate that, in storms where you had more equipment and more manpower, greater cooperation, those kinds of things, that you were more effective than at other times. And that helps make your case rather than you just talking anecdotally about it. To the extent that you're going to be brought in with performance measures, as I talked in module 1, try to be the one that comes up with those and make sure they're things that you actually can control, as I said before. There's all kinds of storm records you can use. You don't have to make up your own, but you certainly can. You know, there's an example in NCHRP that you can utilize. I think the Salt Institute has one. They're all over the place, and so you can look and get some ideas. Yeah, there's a Salt Institute one. Again, safety. Remember I talked in module 1 about, you know, the idea that even when we do our job and do it right to the letter, right? We're sharp as a tack, we're well rested, we're well trained, we're paying attention, we're not distracted, the equipment's in good order, and still a pedestrian gets struck. And I go, wow, it can happen even then when I'm doing all the things right. Any one of those, we relax a little bit and we really start to roll the dice a bit. There are going to be, at least partway into the storm, there are going to be motorists, there are going to be pedestrians, there's going to be kids playing in snowbanks. We've just got to be really mindful of it, particularly as the storm starts to wane, I think. You know, in our area, we get a lot of ATVs running across cornfields and out into the roadway, and other parts of the country, there's snowmobiles, and I mean, there's menaces everywhere. And we've got to just make sure that we're, you know, we're taking good care of ourselves, rest when we can, drink lots of water, make sure we eat well, or at least reasonably well, and take care of ourselves. So, as I told you before, when we get to this point, you know, we're in the home stretch, so we're probably about 10, 15 minutes out. So that was the stuff that we wanted to talk about freeze point depressants and abrasives and all the chemicals and things that we use, as well as a couple of other things to round out sort of game day. We talked last time about post-storm activities. Some of the things that we want to do in the postseason are very similar to those, and so you're going to see me move through this pretty quickly. There's a couple of things that we're going to add. There's a couple of things, most of these we're going to drill deeper into, right? So the between storm stuff are things that we're going to do to make sure we're ready for the next storm, and that we've sort of cleaned some stuff up a little bit, right? Taking care of the real critical safety issues and things like that. Once we're pretty sure the season's behind us, and much like the beginning of the season, who knows when that is? You know, we've seen storms around here as late as April 1st or even later. They're usually not much to speak of, but they're there. But usually well in advance of that, we get to disconnect plows and things. But when we're pretty sure that snow and ice season is behind us, we want to start looking at some of these things. So now's the time where, even though we've tried to clean the equipment between storms, we really want to do a real thorough job of cleaning the equipment. We want to get some high flows across the equipment into the nooks and crannies. We want to get some high pressure in some instances. There's a couple of good videos that we've linked on our Facebook page in the last month or so, but you can also find them yourselves. But they, you know, one of those in particular, you know, a lot of videos that we linked had to deal with winter maintenance. There's one in particular that I recall that sort of went through some helpful hints about how to wash down your equipment, and particularly where to use high pressure and not use high pressure. And I think that's something to think about in terms of how you're going to thoroughly go over the equipment. And it's not just salt. There's all kinds of other gunk and stuff that we want to do. As we do this, it's really a good practice. Let's do a thorough inspection at that point. It's going to serve us well through the summer as we use this equipment, but it's also going to tell us, I've got safety lights that are out. I need to get those ordered or get them replaced. I've got a broken part of my plow. I got a broken weld. I got a chain that's wearing. The cutting edges are pretty well spent. That's something that we can then be working on and not let it become an emergency come the fall. With spare parts and things, we want to do some inventory. There's a lot of inventory we'll want to do. Again, we really want to go through the equipment quite thoroughly. We want to store the equipment. So again, these are not ideal ways to store the equipment. It may be what we have, but we want to, you know, progressively get better and better and better in terms of what our storage capability is to protect this equipment. But we want to make the best use of whatever it is that we've got. Again, some start to get better than others. We want to take a look at our materials. So now's the time where we really ought to tidy up the piles, get a good sense of it. Increasingly with things like this, we used to have to sort of take some estimates of, you know, increasingly now we'll put a drone in the barn, right? Run a drone over it, do a LiDAR scan, come back, run those numbers. And I've got a pretty accurate picture of exactly how much material's in that barn. So again, that's just another example of how technology has come along and made things either easier or better or both. If we are in a position where we say, well, we've depleted our materials pretty good, just as we expected, we're going to need more materials for next year. Well, this is a great time to go ahead and get those orders in. If we have use it or lose it funds in this year's budget, this year's fiscal year, then what better way to use those materials or those funds than to get material that we know we're going to need come fall anyway. So this is a really good time come, you know, late March and early April to go ahead and take those measures as well. We should now, again, I would argue we should do a debrief between storms, but now at the end of the season, again, close the doors, nobody else allowed in. It's just us, right? It's the crew. We're going to talk to each other. We're going to be brutally honest with each other. And, you know, not talk about how we're God's gift to snow plowing, but instead say, well, what went well, what didn't go well, what got in our way, where did we have problems in the chain of command? Where did equipment fail us? Where did, you know, did the mechanics do a really great job of getting me back on the road? You know, whatever. It's not all just negative. Some of it's very positive. We had a great season this year, even though we had some tough storms. Why was that? What was different? You know, explore your successes as much as you do your failures. By doing that, you can start to make some changes. And again, go through all kinds of things with that. And there might be some hurt feelings that are left over. Maybe somebody got on somebody's nerves throughout the season. It's time to make amends and move on because the sun's going to shine now. The things that went poorly, we ought to start a plan of action to try to correct it if it's within our power. The things that went well, we ought to, you know, continue to repeat those, but we also ought to have a look as how we can leverage those into even bigger successes in the future. Again, it's all part of sort of our loop back process, or it should be, as we're talking about our snow and ice control planning in the future. It's at that point, again, remember you know, some of you may have rolled your eyes when I talked about trying to win the hearts and minds of the public. We ought to go back out to the stakeholder community. We ought to, you know, however disingenuous it might be, we ought to thank them for their cooperation with us this season. We should report back to the elected officials and say, this is how we think we did. You know, we used our funds well, given the equipment and manpower and funding that we had for materials and things, we were able to meet our levels of service, or we fell short, and here's what we're going to do about that. When you're the first critic of yourself with elected officials, they're more likely to cut you some slack and want to know how they can help, in my experience. Postseason, we got to get in. Maybe there's some things we didn't have to do between storms. Maybe we were able to just throw some cold patch in a pothole. But if we've got one that's going to, you know, eat somebody's lunch or create an accident or what have you, maybe we need to get back in there. We may need to go in and do some sweep ups, vacuum up of residual materials on the roadway, particularly if we use a lot of abrasives. You know, we may have some areas where we've damaged storm grates and things like that. We don't want that to get away from us. And so to the extent that we can free anything up towards the end of the season to get in and make some more permanent repairs, the better. Certainly to the extent any of those things like signs and signposts and safety features, we want to hit that. So again, you know, areas like this where we've got dislodged, you know, water valves or inlets or what have you, these can start to be a safety problem come spring, and they're not going to get better. They're going to get worse. You know, any of the safety features, again, if they've been knocked down, maybe it wasn't the worst thing in the world that we lost a curve ahead sign because it was borderline required to begin with. But certainly by the end of the season, we ought to get in there and get that taken care of. Certainly anything like these, if these have been damaged and maybe we had some temporary crash drums or something like that in their place, we don't want to use them over the long term. We want to get the right fix back into place. If we've got areas where we've had big snows, big melts, carried, high velocity melting waters have carried a lot of debris. We want to go out and make sure that we, sort of declog some of those drainage areas, just like we did in the beginning of the season, because the spring rains are going to come and we're just going to be in worse condition for it. So we ought to at least go out and do some inspection work. Bridges, to the extent that we have the ability to, clean drainage scuppers, get some of the residual, de-icing materials off of them so that they're not trapping water and holding water in those areas that are going to cause a lot of corrosion. That's all going to be to our benefit to the extent that we have the ability to do that. And it's at that point that we can forget about it. Once we got all that done, we can pack it all in, do our summer planning, and wait until late July or so to start the whole process over again and start getting our contractors in line. So that's sort of the end of it, I think. And so for those that were wondering to themselves, the band was towed to wet sprocket. So that's how I know I'm at the end. So that's sort of it. Questions. Again, we wrapped up just a little bit early. I assume that doesn't hurt anybody's feelings. But any questions on this module or, or the series as a whole, or things that you guys want to add, or now's the time where you can absolutely tell me I'm full of nonsense. I assume that Rusty and Sandy, there's nothing lingering in the chat pod.
Nothing there. The YouTube channel is posted.
Great.
And the site is, the T2 website is posted.
Excellent. So just to remind everybody, so these slides in PDF form are there, so that where there were links and things like that, they're exercisable links in that PDF, and I would encourage you to explore those a little bit. If again you've got folks who missed this series, the first two modules are on our YouTube channel, and that link we'll have this one up in a few days to join it. So certainly point them to it. You've got my information here and our information, Sandy and Rusty as well, is on our website. Again, I would absolutely, certainly if you got questions about winter maintenance and that kind of thing, by all means reach out and let's chat about that. But if you have other issues that you could use training on that we're not bringing, let us know, and we will do what we can to get it there.
Matt, there's a question that salt or brine, and it's from Donkey. Is it Donk or Donkey?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, well, I mean, in this, in this area in the Mid-Atlantic, there's an increasing use of salt brines, right? Usually, and more often than not, in my experience, using pretty plain vanilla brines. In other words, they're mixing rock salt with water and getting to that 23% concentration. Some of the more sophisticated agencies or the more experimental agencies, even if they're not bigger and more sophisticated, play around with some calcium, magnesium, or calcium or magnesium chlorides. But most of it's driven by rock salt. And much like you all said in the poll, Certainly our larger agencies around here are almost all using it. The DOTs are using anti-icing pretty aggressively. In fact, it's amusing to me because I wasn't on the receiving end of it. But you know, DelDOT, when they started using anti-icing really within the last 10 years, 12 years, something like that, they were just there. It was unmerciful. The comments in the newspaper about these idiots at DelDOT because they were sprinkling water on the roadways in the winter. They're such goobers. And so DelDOT realized, oh, we have to do some education of the public. They don't know what we're doing. And they did. They did a big campaign to get the public to understand why they were doing what they were doing. And then 3 or 4 years ago, there was a storm coming up, but DelDOT had read the forecast and realized that it was going to start out as a rainy, freezing rain event. So they didn't anti-ice. Well, the public lost their mind again because DelDOT were too cheap to anti-ice. So, you know, as a public agency, not just as a DOT, but as a municipal or a county agency, you just can't win with the public sometimes. But yeah, so there's, I would say probably a lot of the counties in Maryland, for example, that I'm familiar with are using anti-icing. At the municipal level, it varies quite a bit more. So, but yeah, we're using quite a bit of it. Okay. Well, again, if there's any other questions, by all means, email me. Otherwise, I'll let you go. Thanks so much, everybody, for participating, and we'll talk to you soon.